They called me the silent woman with the clipboard for the better part of 3 months before either of them learned my name, and by then it didn't matter what they called me, because I already knew everything they'd ever said. I came to Corvin Relay Station the way most linguists come to the edge of the frontier, because nobody else wanted the posting and I didn't ask why before I said yes. It was a resettlement outpost, half-built, strung along a fault line on a world the survey map still labeled provisional. The Corvin Authority had pushed humans and a dozen other species into close quarters out there, because the alternative was leaving them scattered across a dying region with no infrastructure at all, and dying regions don't wait for paperwork. My job was simple on paper: translate. Smooth the friction between species who never had to share a ration line or a medical bay or a single cracked window before. In practice, my job was to sit in corners with a tablet and write down things nobody thought I understood, because the truth about translation work is that the moment people believe you're fluent, they stop talking freely in front of you. The moment they believe you're not, they say everything. I let them believe what was convenient. I'd learned Assa and Thren's dialect 11 years before I ever set foot on Corvin, in a cold annex outside a different relocation camp on a different dying world, taught by an old interpreter who'd buried 2 daughters and had nothing left to do with his evenings but drill grammar into a stubborn human woman who showed up every night at 6 and refused to leave until he was tired of teaching her. His name was Vale, and he'd run the same camp's intake office for 30 years before I met him, long enough to watch 3 generations of displaced families pass through his door, long enough to have buried his own children somewhere along the way without ever once telling me how. He used to say the tongue had 2 registers: the open one, spoken to outsiders, full of soft consonants and easy vowels, built for trade and apology and small kindness, and the closed one, the one spoken between family, between people who'd bled the same blood, sharp and fast and built to wound, because a wound from someone who loves you cuts differently than a wound from a stranger, and the closed register exists so that the people who use it never forget the difference. He taught me both. He said a translator who only knows the open register is a tourist, someone who collects a language the way other people collect souvenirs, fluent enough to be polite and useless for anything that mattered. He wanted me to be something else. He never told me exactly what that something else would cost, in the long years of sitting silent in rooms where people assumed I understood nothing. But I think he knew, even then, and let me find that part out for myself. I was something else by the time I got to Corvin. I just didn't advertise it. Assa and Thren came through intake in my 2nd week. Sisters, the elder maybe 26 in human years and the younger 22, both of them with skin the color of wet slate and eyes like cut amber, the kind of bone structure that made every human on the station stop what they were doing to look twice. They'd lost their parents in the same disaster that lost half the registry its families, a reactor failure on a transport convoy 3 systems over, the kind of accident nobody survives clean. The authority filed them as unaccompanied, gave them a shared bunk in the East Residential Wing, and assigned me as their liaison because liaison was my job, and because somebody, somewhere on a form, had decided that grief made people easier to manage if a single translator stayed close and consistent. They hated me on sight. Not personally, they didn't know me well enough yet to hate me personally. They hated what I represented, which was the entire apparatus that had moved them, processed them, filed them, and would go on filing them for the rest of their displaced lives. I understood that. I'd seen it 100 times before, in 100 relocation camps, the particular fury of people who have lost everything, and are now expected to be grateful for a cot and a ration card, and a woman with a tablet asking them gently, in careful broken phrases of the open register, whether they were settling in all right. That first intake interview ran long, longer than most, because Thren wouldn't stop watching the door the entire time, and Assa answered every question with the flattest, most clipped version of the open register I'd heard from either of them. The kind of deliberately bad grammar a fluent speaker uses to signal exactly how little effort they intend to put into being understood. I logged the standard notes: grief-appropriate withdrawal, elevated vigilance consistent with recent trauma, recommend continued monitoring, and said nothing about the fact that I'd caught, underneath Ussa's clipped open register answers, 2 full sentences traded between the sisters in the closed register that had nothing to do with grief at all, and everything to do with making sure neither of them had said anything, on the official record, that could be traced back to a name I didn't yet have. So I asked them gently, in careful broken phrases, whether they were settling in all right, and Ussa looked at her sister and said, "In the closed register, fast and low, she sounds like she's reciting a children's primer, this one. They send us a woman who can barely order food and call it compassion." And Thren laughed, not cruelly, just tired, the laugh of someone who needed something to be funny because the alternative was screaming, and said, "Don't waste energy on her. She won't last the season. None of them do. They get reassigned the second something interesting happens somewhere else." I wrote nothing down. I smiled the patient, slightly dim smile I'd practiced for 11 years, and said, in the open register, that I hoped they'd let me know if they needed anything, and left. I want to be honest about what I felt walking back to the admin block that day, because the honest answer isn't noble. It wasn't hurt, not exactly. It was recognition. I'd been underestimated by experts before. Grieving people are the best in the galaxy at sizing up exactly how much someone is worth their attention, and exactly how much someone is worth ignoring, and I'd built a whole career on being filed under ignorable. It cost me nothing to let 2 orphaned sisters decide I was a primer-reciting bureaucrat with a clipboard. It bought me something worth more than my pride. I got to hear what they actually thought, instead of the careful, performed gratitude every relocated family learns to put on for the people processing their paperwork. What I didn't expect in those first weeks was how much there'd be to hear. The ground at Corven had been unstable since before the station existed. That was public record. In the survey reports nobody outside the geology team bothered reading. The seismologists, a tired trio led by a man named Akafer who hadn't slept properly since I'd arrived, had spent 2 years tracking a deep seam of mineral deposit running under the eastern ridge, something dense and reactive that shifted under pressure and changed the way tremors move through bedrock. Small quakes had been a fact of life at the station since the first prefab went up. You learned to live with the floor humming under your boots twice a week, the way you learned to live with weather. Akafer's team kept saying the pattern was worsening. Command kept saying the pattern was within tolerance. That argument had been running since before I landed, and I'd long since learned to read the tension of it in the way the science staff ate their meals fast and didn't sit near command staff in the mess hall. I'd had dinner with Akafer twice in my first month. The way new staff at any isolated posting end up sharing meals with whoever else is awake and willing to talk past the official hours. He told me, the second time, over reconstituted protein that tasted faintly of nothing, that he'd requested a full evacuation contingency plan be drafted 6 months before I arrived, and had been told, politely, that contingency plans for theoretical seismic events weren't a priority use of station resources, while the resettlement effort was still finding its footing. He wasn't bitter about it exactly, more resigned, the particular exhaustion of a man who understood his own data better than anyone above him was willing to, and had run out of new ways to say the same true thing. I remember thinking, at the time, that it was simply one more administrative friction point among dozens at a half-built outpost, the kind of bureaucratic inertia every posting accumulates. I didn't yet understand how directly his warnings and the sisters' fear were going to end up running along the very same fault line. I mention this because it matters later, and because for a long while I thought the ground and the sisters were 2 separate problems, and I was wrong about that the way I've been wrong about very few things in my professional life. Assa worked station maintenance, a job well beneath whatever she trained for before the convoy went down, and she did it with the contempt of someone marking time. Thren, younger, sharper-tongued, helped run the children's intake block, soothing newly orphaned kids through processing with a gentleness she never once extended to an adult. I watched both of them more than they knew, not out of suspicion at first, out of the simple professional habit of tracking the people I was responsible for. But habits like that have a way of noticing things, and within a month I'd noticed three. First, the sisters spoke the closed register to each other constantly, reflexively, the way people speak when they've decided the room around them is empty of anyone who matters. They said things in front of me they'd never have said in front of another alien, things about command, about the food, about which staff members they found tolerable and which they found insufferable. And twice, about me specifically, neither of them complimentary, both of them, I'll admit, not entirely wrong. Second, underneath all the contempt and the grief, there was a discipline to them that didn't track with two girls simply waiting out a relocation. They moved like people keeping a schedule nobody else could see. Thren's children's block shift always ended at the same minute regardless of how busy the block had been. Us's maintenance rounds always carried her past the Eastern Ridge Access Corridor, a corridor with no maintenance need anywhere on its work order, at the same hour, every third day, like clockwork. Third, and this was the one that kept me up at night long before the ground did, they were afraid of something that wasn't grief. Grief I knew. I'd sat with enough of it to recognize its shape, its slow, corrosive weight. What moved under their contempt wasn't that. It was vigilance. The particular coiled alertness of people who expect at any moment to have to run. I didn't push. Pushing was never the job. The job was patience, sit, listen, write down what the open register let me write down, and wait for the closed register to tell me the truth, because eventually it always did. People forget themselves in front of furniture. I had made myself furniture on purpose, and furniture, eventually, hears everything. I spent those weeks the way I'd spent every relocation posting before it, which is to say in motion that looked like stillness from the outside. I sat in on intake interviews I wasn't strictly required to attend. I logged ration complaints nobody else wanted to log. I made myself present at the kind of dull administrative friction points, water rotation disputes, bunk reassignments, the small daily abrasions of too many displaced people sharing too little space, where the open register handled the surface of a complaint and the closed register, muttered afterward between people who assumed I'd already left the room, handled the truth of it. I learned more about Corvin Relay Station in those weeks than Command had learned in 2 years of official reports, not because I was clever, but because nobody guards what they think nobody's listening to. I watched the children's block too, more than once, standing at the doorway with my tablet while Thren worked. She was good at it, genuinely, unperformed good, the kind of gentleness that doesn't survive contact with cynicism unless it's real underneath. She'd crouch to a small frightened thing's eye level and speak the open register slow and warm, the trade tongue softness built for exactly this, and the children settled around her the way frightened things settle around someone who isn't lying to them. It made the closed register fragments I overheard from her later, the urgency in her voice telling Assa to hurry, the flinch every time a maintenance tech passed too close, harder to reconcile, not easier. Cruelty I could have filed and moved past. This wasn't cruelty. This was fear wearing competence as a coat, and competence is a much harder thing to watch fray. Assa was different. Where Thren softened around the children, Assa hardened around everyone, station staff and fellow displaced alike, an equal opportunity contempt that I initially read as simple grief calcified into armor. It took me 3 weeks to notice the pattern underneath it, that her contempt sharpened, specifically and reliably, any time a conversation drifted near transport logistics, convoy registries, anything administrative that touched the machinery of how people got moved from one camp to the next. Most displaced people I'd worked with over the years grew numb to that machinery, resigned to it, the dull fatigue of paperwork that decided your life without asking. Assa wasn't numb. Assa was furious in a focused, specific way that read less like grief and more like someone watching a wound get reopened on purpose, again and again, by people who didn't know they were reopening anything. I started keeping 2 sets of notes after that, the official liaison log I filed weekly for command, full of nothing, full of careful broken phrases and dim observations about settling in progress, and a second log I kept only for myself, in a notebook with no station markings, where I wrote down every closed register fragment in full, dated, sourced, cross-referenced against shift schedules and corridor logs I had no real authority to be reading. I told myself I was building a case in case I ever needed one. I think, if I'm honest, I was also building the courage to use it, fragment by fragment, the way you build anything heavy enough to need scaffolding first. There was an evening, perhaps a month into all this, when I came closer than I'd like to admit to breaking my own discipline early. A junior official from the Regional Transit Authority passed through Corven on routine inspection, the kind of brief bureaucratic visit that meant nothing to most of the station and everything, it turned out, to Assa. I watched her go rigid the moment his name was posted on the visitor manifest, watched her trade a single closed register sentence with Thren in the ration line. If he asks for our convoy number, you don't have one. You were never processed under it. Do you understand me? And watched her avoid every corridor that official might plausibly walk down for the entire 2 days he was on station, routing herself through service passages a maintenance worker had no real reason to know existed. I nearly went to command that night. I had my hand on the tablet, the report half-drafted, before I made myself put it down. A frightened girl avoiding an inspector wasn't evidence of anything beyond fear, and fear alone had never been enough to justify the kind of intervention that could unravel 2 lives built on secrecy for reasons I still didn't understand. I deleted the draft. I told myself again that the whole truth was still coming if I could only be patient enough to let it arrive on its own schedule instead of mine. It was Assa who said the thing that turned the whole season, on an ordinary Tuesday 6 weeks in the corridor outside the ration depot, not knowing I was 3 meters behind her with my tablet and my dim, patient face. "Stop dragging your feet," she said to Thren, closed register, urgent under the casualness. "Corvus won't wait for us if we're late again." You know what he said the last time. Thren said something back I didn't fully catch, a name, half swallowed, and Assa cut her off with a flick of her hand, and a word I recognized instantly, because it was a word my old teacher had only used once in 11 years of lessons, sitting very still when he said it, the way you go still around something that can still hurt you from a great distance. Brokers. Not traders. Not merchants. The closed register word for the people who moved displaced children and unaccompanied minors through chaotic post-disaster registries and sold the gaps in the paperwork to whoever was buying. I'd seen the aftermath of broker networks twice before in my career, in 2 other relocation camps, both times after the damage was already done, both times standing in rooms full of officials asking each other how nobody had noticed sooner. I went back to my quarters that night and didn't sleep, running the last 6 weeks through my head in the closed register, translating every overheard fragment against this new and terrible context, and the shape that emerged from it made my stomach drop the way solid ground dropping under your boots makes your stomach drop. The sisters weren't hiding from grief. They were hiding from a broker named Corvus, who had moved them once before through a different camp's chaos, who they owed something to or feared something from, and who, based on 3 separate fragments I now reassembled, had a contact inside Corven's own maintenance staff, which was the only way I could explain why Ussa's contempt-laden rounds kept carrying her to a corridor with no work order, at the same hour, every 3rd day, like a woman keeping an appointment she hated. I had 2 choices, and both of them terrified me in different ways. I could go to command with second-hand fragments of an alien dialect they'd take my word on faith for, against two grieving orphans who'd done nothing officially wrong, and risk being the translator who tore apart two traumatized girls' lives on a hunch. Or I could keep listening, keep being furniture, and trust that the closed register would eventually tell me enough to act on with certainty instead of suspicion. I chose to keep listening. I want to say that decision came from wisdom. Some of it did. Some of it, if I'm honest with the page the way I've never been honest with command, came from the old interpreter's voice in my head, the one who taught me both registers and told me a translator who only knows the open one is a tourist. He'd have told me a translator who acts on a fragment instead of the whole truth is worse than a tourist. He'd have told me to wait until I had it all. So I waited, and the ground, as it turned out, was not willing to wait with me. Akafar's team called the first real warning on a gray morning 4 days after I overheard the broker's name, a tremor pattern that didn't match the station's usual humming background noise. Sharper, deeper, the kind of seismic signature that meant the mineral seam under the eastern ridge had shifted in a way his models hadn't accounted for. Command, predictably, wanted more data before triggering an evacuation order that would cost them weeks of resettlement progress and an ugly line in their quarterly report. I wasn't in that meeting. I heard about it from a tired, exhausted tech in the mess hall who didn't realize how closely I was listening. Because, by then listening closely to things nobody expected me to follow had become less a professional habit than something closer to a discipline of faith. What I did know with absolute clarity was that the Eastern Ridge Access Corridor, Assa's unexplained appointment, every third day like clockwork, ran directly along the worst section of the failing seam. I went to her that evening, not to command. Her alone in the narrow utility space behind the maintenance bay where she ate her meals apart from everyone, because even contempt needs somewhere private to sit and eat. She looked up when I came in, annoyed in the particular way she reserved for me, and said, in the open register, slow and clipped, the way you'd explain something to a child or a very stupid adult, that she was on her break and didn't have anything for the station liaison today. I sat down across from her anyway. And I said not in the open register, not in the careful broken phrases she'd spent 6 weeks deciding, were the extent of what I had, I said, in the closed register, fast and clean, and exactly the way my old teacher had drilled into me on 100 cold nights, that the Eastern Ridge Corridor was failing, that the seam underneath it had shifted, and that whatever appointment she kept there every third day with Corvus's contact was about to get her killed by something far less negotiable than a broker. I have translated for a living for 16 years. I have stood in rooms where languages collided and watched understanding click into place behind 100 different sets of eyes. I have never, before or since, watched anything move through a face the way that moment moved through Assa's. She froze. Not metaphorically, actually froze. The half-raised spoon stopped in the air, her whole body gone rigid the way a person goes rigid when the floor they've been standing on turns out to be a thin shell over a drop they didn't know was there. Her amber eyes went wide and then narrow, recalculating 6 weeks of careless contempt at the speed of dawning horror, every word she and her sister had ever spoken in front of me replaying behind her face in real time. I watched her count it. I watched her arrive, with visible physical pain at the total. You understood, she said, not a question. Closed register, barely above a whisper, like saying it any louder would make it more true than it already, unbearably, was. Every word, I said, for 11 years. What came out of her after that, once the shaking stopped, once Thren was fetched from the children's block white-faced and shaking herself, was the whole shape of it, the thing I'd been assembling from fragments for 6 weeks finally laid out whole and terrible in front of me. Corvus wasn't a broker who'd moved them once. He was the broker who'd moved their parents' transport convoy registry, falsified manifests, skimmed resettlement funds, the kind of quiet administrative theft that doesn't show up as a crime until you trace exactly which families never got the support they were owed. The reactor failure that killed their parents hadn't been an accident in the way the official record claimed. It had been a convoy running on falsified safety certifications Corvus's network had sold cheap to cut costs, and the sisters were two of perhaps 30 surviving children across half a dozen camps who knew it, who'd pieced it together in whispers and closed register fragments of their own over years of relocation, and who Corvus was now systematically hunting down and silencing, one quiet appointment at a time, before any of them could put the pieces together loud enough for an authority to listen. The Eastern Ridge Corridor wasn't a meeting place. It was where Corvus's contact, a maintenance tech named Bray who'd been on station 18 months, and whom nobody had ever flagged, delivered threats disguised as routine check-ins, and warnings about what would happen to Thren if Assa ever said the wrong thing to the wrong official. They'd been managing it alone, the way displaced children learn to manage everything alone, certain that no authority on any station had ever protected them before and wouldn't start now, certain. And this was the part that cut deepest, hearing it in their own voice instead of pieced from fragments, that a translator who could barely manage the open register was the last person in the galaxy equipped to help them. I sat with that a long moment before I answered. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wanted them to feel the silence the same way I'd let them feel 6 weeks of mine. Thren had stopped shaking by then, sitting pressed shoulder to shoulder with her sister the way siblings sit when they've spent years learning that proximity is the only safety either of them can guarantee the other. She watched me with an expression I hadn't seen on her before, not in 6 weeks of soothing frightened children at the intake block, something closer to the look the children themselves wore, the wide, unguarded look of someone bracing to be told a kindness was conditional after all. "What happens now," she asked, closed register asterisk to us, "if you tell command everything? What happens to 2 displaced girls who let a broker's contact threaten them for months and never reported it?" It was a fair question, and an old one. I'd heard versions of it in every camp I'd ever worked. The particular fear of the already failed by the system, that any new attention from the system will only produce a new failure, dressed up as help. I told her the truth instead of a comfort, because comfort wasn't what would keep either of them alive past the next 18 hours. I told her command would ask hard questions, that there would be statements and verifications and the slow grinding machinery of an investigation, and that none of it would be gentle. And I told her that none of it would matter half as much as getting her and her sister off that ridge before the ground decided the question for all of us. Ussa's spoon was still in her hand, forgotten, going cold in the bowl. "Why, asterisk," she said, not hostile anymore, just genuinely lost, like the word was the only one left standing after everything else had been knocked down. 6 weeks. You could have said something 6 weeks ago and saved us 6 weeks of being afraid in front of you for nothing. I told her the truth about that too. That I'd had fragments for 6 weeks, not certainty, and a fragment acted on too early can do as much damage as silence held too long. That I'd seen translators before me move on suspicion alone and tear apart relationships with the very people they were trying to protect, because acting on half a truth costs you the second half forever. I told her I was sorry it had cost her 6 weeks of fear in front of a woman who could have shortened it. I told her I wasn't sorry for waiting until I knew enough to be useful, instead of merely alarming. She didn't answer that right away. She looked at me for a long moment, really looked. The first time in 6 weeks she'd looked at me like I was a person and not a clipboard with legs. And then she said, quietly in the closed register, the register reserved for family, for the people who'd earned the right to wound you because they loved you enough to risk it. Then don't wait anymore. Help us. Then I told them in the closed register, slow and certain, that I was done being furniture. The next 18 hours moved fast in the way disasters move fast, not as one single event, but as a stack of events each forcing the next. And I lived through most of it with a tablet in one hand and a borrowed station radio in the other, translating in both directions faster than I'd ever translated in my life. Because for the first time in 11 years, I had nothing left to hide and everything left to say. I went to HFY first, not Command HFY, who'd been begging Command for an evacuation order for 4 days and getting nowhere, and who took one look at the new seismic readings. I brought him cross-referenced against the Eastern Ridge Corridor's exact coordinates and went the color of old paper. The seam wasn't just shifting. It was venting, small fractures opening along its length, pressure building toward something his models had only ever modeled as theoretical. The corridor Bray used for his quiet threats sat directly above the worst of it. Whatever timeline Corvus's network thought they had to keep silencing witnesses, the planet had just handed them a much shorter one, and the planet didn't care who got caught underground when it ran out. HFY ran the new numbers twice, hands shaking slightly the way exhausted scientists' hands shake when a model finally agrees with the fear they've been carrying alone for weeks. And then he did something I hadn't seen him do in 3 months on station. He stopped asking permission. He pulled every member of his team off their assigned tasks, declared an internal emergency under the geology team's own limited authority, and started drafting an evacuation recommendation with my translated testimony folded directly into the seismic brief. Because a story about a broker network silencing witnesses on top of a failing seam was a story Command couldn't file under within tolerance the way they'd filed every previous warning. I went to Command second, and for once in my Corven career, I didn't speak gently or carefully or in patient broken phrases. I laid out the broker network, the falsified convoy manifests, Bray's 18 months of unflagged corridor visits, and the geology team's failing seam, all at once. All in the open register this time because Command needed to understand every word of it without translation, and I watched the dim, slightly amused expression officials had worn around me for 3 months curdle into something closer to alarm, as they realized exactly how much the silent woman with the clipboard had been quietly building a case nobody had asked her to build. The station director, a clipped efficient woman named Hazanwi who'd barely acknowledged my presence in 3 months of briefings, asked me only one question once I'd finished, not whether I was certain, but how long I'd known, and said nothing. And I told her the truth, that I'd known fragments for 6 weeks and certainty for less than 2 hours, and that the difference between those two things was the only reason I trusted what I was telling her now. They moved fast once they understood. Security picked up Bray within the hour, in the maintenance bay mid-shift, with enough evidence on his own terminal, sloppy, the way people get sloppy when they've never once been suspected, to confirm everything the sisters had pieced together in whispers across half a dozen years and half a dozen camps. He didn't resist. I watched through the security office's narrow window as 2 officers walked him out, and he looked, more than anything, relieved. The particular slumped relief of a man who'd been carrying a much heavier weight than anyone watching him had ever guessed, and was glad in the end to finally set it down even at the cost of everything that came after. Command issued the evacuation order HFY had been begging for 4 days to get, and the station moved the way stations only move once, when everyone finally understands at the same moment that the danger was never theoretical. I spent the next several hours doing the only thing I'd ever been good at doing under pressure, translating, fast in both directions, between Command's evacuation directives and the dozen non-human residential blocks who needed every instruction delivered in a register they'd actually trust, because panic spreads twice as fast through people who suspect the announcement isn't being given to them straight. I went block to block with a runner from security, repeating the same calm, certain phrases in 4 different dialects, watching frightened families gather what little they could carry, and moved toward the western shelters in long, unbroken lines, the ground humming harder under all of our boots with every passing hour as the seams fractures widened beneath the eastern ridge. I found Assa and Thren in the chaos near the children's block. Thren already mid-evacuation of a dozen small, terrified things she refused to leave behind, even with the ground shuddering harder by the minute, sorting them into a transport line with the same unflinching gentleness I'd watched her use for 6 quiet weeks, except now there was nothing performed about the urgency underneath it. Assa was beside her, no longer hardened, no longer contemptuous, working a supply cart with the kind of focused efficiency people find only when the thing they've spent years bracing against has finally, terribly, arrived, and there's nothing left to do but meet it. The eastern ridge gave way 40 minutes after the last transport cleared the corridor zone, a long, shuddering collapse visible even from the western shelters, a column of pale dust rising off the ridge and catching the late sun, turning gold against a sky that hadn't yet decided whether to stay blue. It took half the maintenance bay and the failing corridor down with it, the same corridor where a broker's contact had spent 18 months delivering quiet threats to 2 grieving sisters, gone now, buried under a fall of rock and ridge dust, in daylight, with every soul on station already safely west of it because somebody had finally listened in time. I remember standing at the shelter perimeter with Assa and Thren on either side of me, watching that column of gold dust climb and spread and finally settle, the ground still humming faintly under our boots the way it had hummed since the day I arrived, and thinking that the old interpreter who taught me both registers 11 years ago, in a cold annex outside a dying camp, had given me something he probably never imagined would end with 2 strangers' lives in the balance. He'd wanted me to be something more than a tourist in someone else's grief. He hadn't told me what to do once I was. I'd had to work that part out myself, in real time, with the ground falling away under all of us. Corvess's network unraveled over the following weeks the way these things do once one thread is pulled hard enough, slow, then all at once, a dozen falsified manifests across half a dozen relocation camps coming to light. Other surviving children from other dying convoys, finally able to say out loud what they'd only ever dared whisper in the closed register to each other. I won't pretend I fixed it alone. I pulled one thread. The rest came undone, because enough people, finally, were willing to listen to the children who'd been waiting years for someone to. Bray talked, eventually, once the weight of standing alone for a man like Corvess outweighed whatever loyalty or fear had kept him quiet for 18 months. He gave investigators 3 more contacts across 2 other relocation authorities, and those 3 contacts gave up 4 more. And somewhere in the 3rd week of the investigation, a regional transit auditor finally connected the falsified convoy manifest that killed the sisters' parents to 17 other manifests across a span of years. All of them cheaper, all of them faster, all of them filed by officials who never had to look the families in the eye after the paperwork cleared. Corvess himself was 3 jurisdictions away by the time anyone moved to arrest him, already running, already shedding identities the way he taught his network to shed evidence. But a name that's been spoken aloud by enough surviving witnesses stops being a ghost, and I heard, months later, second-hand through Akafar's contacts in the regional authority, that they finally caught up with him on a transit world 2 systems over, trying to board a convoy under a manifest that wasn't his. The rebuild at Corven took the better part of 2 months. Command shifted the station's footprint west onto bedrock the geology team had cleared as stable, a slower, less efficient relocation than anyone wanted, but nobody argued the point twice after watching the eastern ridge come down. I spent those weeks doing ordinary liaison work again, settling new arrivals, smoothing the same small daily frictions I'd smoothed for 3 months before any of this started, except now half the station knew exactly how much I'd been hearing the whole time, and the work changed shape because of it. People spoke more carefully around me, which I understood, and a few spoke more honestly, which I hadn't expected and found I valued more than I'd ever valued the easy invisibility of before. Thren came to find me on one of those ordinary afternoons, off shift, no children trailing behind her for once, and sat across from me in the mess hall without asking permission the way she would have 3 months earlier. She told me, in a mixture of both registers that I'd come to recognize as her honest voice, the open register's warmth carrying the closed register's weight, that she'd spent every night since the corridor's collapse running the numbers on how close it had come. 4 days of Akaffer's warnings going unheeded. 6 weeks of me gathering fragments instead of acting on the first one. 18 months of Bray's quiet threats going unreported because 2 girls had decided, long before they ever met me, that no authority anywhere could be trusted with the whole truth. She said the math terrified her more than the ground ever had, because the ground, at least, gave warning. People had to choose to listen. You chose, she said, eventually. I keep trying to decide if eventually is good enough. I told her I didn't have a tidy answer for that because I didn't. I told her that eventually had cost her 6 weeks of fear she shouldn't have had to carry alone, and that I'd live with that the same way she'd live with everything else this last year had cost her, not resolved, just carried, the way the heaviest things usually are. I told her that the alternative, acting too early on too little, had a body count of its own in every camp I'd ever worked, families torn apart on suspicion that turned out to be nothing, trust broken that never came back. There wasn't a version of this where nobody paid a price for the waiting. There was only the version where the price got paid in time to matter, instead of after. She didn't look satisfied by that. I didn't expect her to. But she nodded slow and reached across the table, and for the first time in 3 months let me see her not soothing anyone, not performing competence for a frightened child or contempt for a clipboard, just tired and young, and finally, cautiously, willing to trust that the silence around her wasn't always a threat waiting to close. Assa and Thren stayed at Corven through the rebuild, the eastern ridge fenced off and monitored, the station's footprint shifted west onto steadier ground. They didn't apologize to me, not in so many words. That's not how either register really works, not for people who have learned the hard way that survival doesn't leave much room for it. But Thren started bringing me tea in the evenings without being asked. And Assa, 3 weeks after the collapse, sat down across from me in the same narrow utility space where she'd first frozen, and asked me, in the closed register this time, deliberately like a door held open, to teach her the words for thank you that weren't the soft, easy ones strangers used. I taught her. There's a register for that too. If you know where to look, fewer people use it than you'd think, because it costs something real to mean it, and most people never learn the difference between the version that's easy to say and the version that costs. I think about that corridor sometimes, the one that doesn't exist anymore, fenced and signed, and slowly being reclaimed by drifting ridge dust. I think about how close those 2 girls came to running out of road entirely, certain to the very end that the quiet woman with the clipboard was exactly as harmless as they needed her to be. I never corrected that assumption while it was useful to let them hold it. I only ever meant to correct it once it would save their lives instead of just my pride. That's the whole trick of the work if there is one. You let the world decide your furniture. You let them talk past you, around you, over you, certain you're catching nothing but the easy half of what they mean. And you wait not forever, never forever, but exactly as long as patience can survive without curdling into cowardice, until the moment arrives that demands the whole truth instead of the comfortable half of it. Then you speak, every word. And you watch in whatever face is in front of you, the precise instant they understand that they were never as alone or as unheard as the silence had let them believe. I've been asked since, by people back at the relay station who heard the story secondhand and got it wrong in the retelling the way stories always get told wrong, why I waited so long to say something. Why I let 2 grieving girls mock a woman who could have stopped Corvus's network the day she landed, if she'd only spoken up sooner. I tell them the truth, which is less satisfying than the version they want. I didn't know enough that first week to be sure of anything beyond two sisters' grief and contempt. Certainty took 6 weeks of silence to build, fragment by fragment, the way trust always takes longer to earn than people want it to. If I'd spoken on the first day, I'd have had nothing but suspicion and a broken open relationship with 2 children who needed, more than anything else on that station, one single adult who'd simply wait. There's a version of this story, the version that gets told secondhand at other postings, where I'm the clever one, the patient mastermind who saw everything coming from the start. That version flatters me, and it isn't true. I didn't see the ground failing. I didn't predict the corridors collapse down to the hour. I caught fragments the way anyone catches fragments, slow and uncertain, and I made the only decision that ever felt like mine to make in the whole affair, which was simply to keep listening past the point where it would have been easier to stop. Vale used to say that was the whole discipline, in the end, not cleverness, not some gift for languages, just the willingness to sit still in a room long after everyone in it has decided you've stopped mattering, and to keep your ears open anyway. I think about him more now than I did before Corvin. I think he would have approved of how it ended and said nothing about how close it came. So I waited, and when the ground finally cracked open under all of us, I had the whole truth ready in both registers, and I used every word of it. They don't call me the silent woman with the clipboard anymore. I didn't ask them to stop. They just did, on their own, the way people do once they've finally been heard by someone they assumed could never understand them at all.